We know that from last episode, Rosewood sits in a strange place in American memory. Not because it's hard to understand, but because it isn't. To borrow from Disney, it's a tale as old as time. A black town, a white accusation, a mob that gathers, homes that get burned, people who get hunted, and families that get scattered. None of it's that complicated, nor does it come with a catchy little tune. But because it isn't, we tend to stop there. Maybe we can call this complicity, or at least sometimes involuntary complicity. But we mark the violence as a story, and then we allow the silence and the cover-up after that to take care of the rest. The truth is, what happened in Rosewood and other cities didn't end when the fires went out. It was only the first phase. What followed was quieter. There were no mobs, there were no gunshots, there wasn't even urgency. Just decisions. Decisions about how to describe what happened, about what forms and news copy to file, about what to fund and finance, about what to teach, but mostly what not to talk about at all. And over time, those decisions did something remarkable. They made towns disappear off the map without even needing to deny that they ever existed. That complicit erasure is the part that I want to stay with. Now, understand that erasure isn't the absence of memory. It's the presence of a political, cultural, and financial process. The catch here is that a process doesn't require everyone to agree, only enough people in the right places and in the right positions of power who are all making the same small choices. Language, paperwork, and then silence. Most of us are taught to think of history as a record of what happened, but history is also a record of what survived the people who had the power to shape it. And that distinction matters, because it explains how events that devastate entire communities can become footnotes or vanish entirely within a generation. Rosewood wasn't forgotten, it was outworked. And this episode isn't about the violence itself. We named that already. We sat with it. This episode is about what comes next, about how harm continues after the visible damage stops. And once you start looking for that pattern, you see it repeating in places like Tulsa, which show us what erasure looks like when a community is too large to disappear. And in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, where we see what it looks like when erasure doesn't just hide violence, but it legitimizes it. Different places, different outcomes, same mechanism. I'm your host, Chuck Lenihan, and this is episode 2 of Committed to Misunderstanding. They didn't just burn it, they erased it.
I committed to misunderstanding. Say I didn't know, then do nothing, same old branding. Turn the page, read the margin, hear what's been muffling. We're done with the cover-up, we're done with the bluff.
So let's define the mechanism of erasure. If we don't name it clearly, then we'll miss it when we see it. When people hear erasure, they picture forgetting, time passing, details fading, memories dissolving into the past, and that's not what this is. Erasure, it's not a passive thing. It's a procedural thing. It doesn't happen because people forget. It happens because our systems are the ones that we allowed to decide things, such as naming. The first description of an event becomes the scaffolding for everything that follows. If something's labeled a riot, for example, that word doesn't just describe chaos. It redistributes blame. A riot suggests mutual violence, shared responsibility, uncontrolled emotion. It obscures coordination, it softens intent. And let's be real. Once that word is used and it's set in stone, insurance companies decide that they're going to proceed differently. Prosecutors proceed differently. History books summarize differently. And that language becomes policy. And then once we have the language down, we have to move on to documentation. So what gets written down? What gets counted? What gets left unofficial and out of all of the policy? Death tolls aren't verified. Property claims aren't recorded. Deputizations that aren't logged clearly or done correctly. And so if the paperwork is incomplete, the accountability is incomplete, and incomplete records become permanent ambiguity. And what does the ambiguity do? It protects power. That's what it's designed to do. We're seeing it now. Just watch any congressional hearing. You'll see. Third thing we look for is institutional follow-through. After the headlines fade, the decisions are made quietly. The zoning changes, the building codes get adjusted, loan access gets restricted. We get redistricting. Nothing dramatic, but definitely long-lasting and durable. When rebuilding becomes structurally harder, the destruction doesn't need to be repeated. The damage sustains itself. And when we look at education, are you kidding me? What gets a chapter in a history book? What gets a paragraph? What just becomes a footnote? Or even better, what disappears entirely? What does the next generation inherit? It gets a sanitized version of the original harm that's no longer visible enough to demand repair. And then the critical part becomes that erasure doesn't require conspiracy. It just requires alignment. Enough editors choosing the same headline, enough officials filling out the same report, enough educators repeating the same summary. No secret meetings, just repetition. That's the mechanism. It's not even anything spectacular. It's just an administrative, bureaucratic way of doing bullshit. And once you understand that, you stop looking for dramatic denial. You start looking for subtle consistency. Rosewood was small enough to disappear physically. Tulsa wasn't. Tulsa required containment instead of disappearance. And Wilmington, holy crap, Wilmington required something even more dangerous. It required certification. It required the first in the country's coup d'etat. We'll get to that. Let's go to Tulsa first. You think you know this town, and you think you know its history, but for the people that this podcast is truly for, the people whose melanin color is more like mine and lighter, I'm willing to bet that you don't know half of this shit. Enter with me into the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, circa 1921. I feel like Rod Serling. Many of us know this more colloquially as Black Wall Street. And when people talk about this part of Tulsa in this period of time, they start with the scale. The size of Greenwood at this time is about 1.5 square miles, covering 35 square blocks, with a population between 10 and 11,000 Black people. They say that again. 10 to 11,000 Black people in this one town. Not 60 years after the end of the Civil War. It's huge. They talk about the number of businesses being between 150 and 200 Black-owned and operated businesses. There's grocery stores, hotels, restaurants, barbershops and beauty parlors, doctors on lawyers' offices, hospitals, the library, the Tulsa Star newspaper, and Black-owned Dreamland Theater, pool halls, drugstores, clothing stores, everything that you would find in any town of this, any city of this size, any white city of this size. And so because of that, then we also have to talk about the wealth. And that is important, but not for the reason that most people think it is. Greenwood mattered because it was visible. This is a time in our nation's history when Black people were still, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, bowing their heads, not making eye contact with white people because they were still a subservient class, if you can even consider them a class. I mean, sure, they had the vote and they had, citizenship, but let's face it, they were still second class, third class, or less citizens. And so we have Greenwood, who's not only a visible town, but a rich, visible town. And Greenwood's wealth, it wasn't about raw dollar amounts. It was about the high rates of black property ownership. About a self-sustaining business ecosystem, capital that's circulating within the community that didn't go into the white parts of town. It stayed in the black parts of town. So we have a professional class that challenged the white supremacist economic hierarchy. Greenwood wasn't wealthy because everyone was rich. it was wealthy because ownership was concentrated in the black hands, the black land, the black storefronts and professional services. It was a self-sustaining economy that wasn't hidden with, marginality. That economic autonomy is what made it threatening. White people didn't like that. I believe the saying probably would have been, not quite this nice, but they would have talked about the uppity black people. Prosperity doesn't exist in a vacuum, and Greenwood was thriving. Tulsa as a whole was booming at this time. They had just discovered oil, so oil money was reshaping the entire city. Population was exploding all over Oklahoma, specifically here. Political power was shifting as well. And underneath that expansion sat something volatile. The 1920s weren't neutral years. They were years of backlash. World War I had just ended. Black veterans were returning home in uniform, but still second, third, fourth class citizens. The Great Migration was underway. Black political and economic confidence was rising across the nation. And in response, fucking white people, white supremacist organizing, that intensified. So we're at 1921. Remember from last episode, we talked about the fact that Birth of a Nation spent a year and more as the #1 movie across the country. And so, of course, the KKK was growing. Lynchings were daily almost. They weren't rare. They were public warnings. And Tulsa wasn't insulated from that atmosphere. It was steeped in it. Local newspapers had printed racially inflammatory language routinely. Rumors, they traveled all over the place, of course. And that fear got weaponized really easily. So Greenwood's successes didn't sit quietly inside. It stood out. And standing out in 1921 Oklahoma, that carried risk. Now, understand something critical. Mass violence doesn't begin with fire. It begins with narrative. It begins with a story told in a way that invites reaction. And so on May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day, that story arrives. A black teenager by the name of Dick Rowland. He's accused of assaulting a white elevator operator named Sarah Page. The details here are kind of murky, and the accusations, they conflict. Because again, this is what happens. It's he said, she said, and it's white versus black. There's no confirmed evidence of any assault, but accuracy was not the accelerant here. The headline language was. Turns out that the Tulsa Tribune, a white newspaper, publishes a story about it. The phrasing is charged. The suggestion is crystal clear. The subtext is completely unmistakable. And so late afternoon, the next day, May 31st, Dick Rowland is arrested and detained at the Tulsa courthouse. Rumors, again, I told you before that they run rampant. They did here too. So rumors spread pretty rapidly through Tulsa that Rowland was going to be lynched. This escalates fear and urgency in both the white and the black communities. The white people want a part of it because this town is already a powder keg of white supremacy and racism. And the black community doesn't want any part of it, and they're not going to have any of their people lynched. And so a white crowd gathers outside the courthouse. They grow in size and volatility as the evening wears on. Probably about 500 people, 300 to 500 people, I think is the numbers that I saw. And well, the Greenwood residents, they understand the problem here. They interpret the crowd's presence as a credible lynching threat. And, given what's going on in this town anyway, they figure that there is going to be some extrajudicial violence. And so a group of about 75 black World War I veterans from Greenwood, they go downtown. They're armed, and their stated intent is to help protect Rowland and prevent a lynching. They told they told the sheriff this. The sheriff says, "Sorry, your assistance isn't necessary here," and they leave. The white crowd continues to grow though, and tensions continue to escalate. They're demanding that Roland is let go, or they're going to storm the courthouse, or whatever. They're going to lynch this man. And so this same group of 75 black men return later, still armed, attempting to, hopefully deter violence through just their mere presence. And of course, as is wont to do, confrontation occurs near the courthouse between the armed black men and the white men in the crowd. Shots get fired. We don't really know who fired first. One side said them, the other side said them. And the situation immediately destabilizes. The crowd surges and violence accelerates from what was a tense standoff to literally open conflict now. And so the courthouse is the ignition point for what follows. Fast forward just a little bit. So we're at approximately 10 p.m. and black residents from the Greenwood group begin retreating north across the Frisco tracks toward Greenwood. Violence is continuously going, right? And so from fanning out from the courthouse area, the white crowds, they're following the black guys, and the violence is moving northward now, crossing back into the black residential and business districts. So this is very intentional, very directional. The spread is intended to be more of a shock and awe than it is to have an isolated clash here and there. This is a huge shift from where the courthouse confrontation was. Continuously moving across Greenwood, and as we move later into the night, white men began gathering weapons in greater numbers. So it's not just a mob. Now it's an armed conflict. However, we, from episode 1, a posse requires deputization. Well, the reports that the state of Oklahoma did does document the deputization occurred of the white civilians. So now we have a much larger number of armed white folks, many of whom are openly white supremacists, that are now operating with perceived authority, police authority. And so the police do what the police do, which is start giving weapons to the armed groups because they're deputized. And so the groups organize into patrol-like units. This is much different. We've now moved from volatile crowd behavior into sanctioned, or at least at a minimum, tolerated armed mobilization. Now, again, remember, this is coordinated movement, not random dispersal. Somewhere around midnight, the gunfire intensifies near the border between downtown Tulsa and Greenwood. At this point, buildings begin being burned along Archer Street, and now we're looking at escalation from confrontation to destruction. The fire serves the purpose of creating a perimeter effect, and so now there's pressure at entry points, which allow for a deeper incursion by the whites. The violence, this follows along the commercial corridors first, targeting businesses and economic infrastructure. Hit them where it hurts, essentially. And this continues on. Now we're in the early morning on June 1st. And between approximately 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., armed white groups are pushing deeper into Greenwood. And as they're going, they are murdering people. And they are burning houses. They are burning businesses. They're moving block by block, going for saturation rather than single flashpoints. Official reports and survivor stories at this point document homes being looted prior to them being torched. So we're adding insult to injury. Not only are we going to burn your shit, but we're going to steal from you first, so that even if you were to find anything, you're not really going to find anything. Black residents are fleeing north and west to escape the advancing violence. White snipers are reported from elevated positions all over town. Greenwood is no longer being confronted. It's being overrun by a de facto army of white supremacists. In the commission report, you'll find that link in the notes, they say that around dawn, now we have machine gun placements. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is now we also have airplanes. Airplanes who are full of white people who are not only bombing, but shooting people in the streets. Incendiary bombs are falling. Snipers, or whatever you call them, are in the planes shooting people, shooting women and children who are running for safety, being shot dead in the street, being gunned down by these white men in airplanes. Fucking white people. Somewhere around 5 or 6 in the morning, National Guard presence increases substantially. The governor's been notified. He mobilizes National Guard. Martial law is declared at this point, and you'd think that it got better. Nah. Of course it didn't. I told you, you didn't know anything about this, right? Because it gets even shittier. Black residents are now rounded up by the National Guard, and they're moved into detention centers. I swear, y'all, I feel like because we refuse to learn from history, we're repeating this very thing right now with these fucking ICE raids. The report documents detention centers established at the convention hall, the fairgrounds, and other holding sites where Greenwood residents are treated as suspects rather than protected as victims. And this is what I mean when I say to those who held the power, they get to reshape the narrative and the record in real time. They have now changed these innocent people who were literally doing nothing, because before the 75 armed men went to the courthouse, everybody else in Greenwood was living their lives. They were there was a prom at the high school. They were going to the theater. They were living their lives. But now they're being rounded up and put into de facto concentration camps. Make it make sense, y'all. By mid-morning on June 1st, we now have, the smoke's clearing, and we can see we have 35 plus square blocks that are destroyed. We have leveled businesses. We have churches that are burned to the ground, homes that are reduced to foundations. The smoke is clearing. We're seeing that not damaging Greenwood, but an aftermath consistent with total community destruction. It's not a disturbance. It's large-scale, comprehensive devastation. 35 square blocks reduced to ash, homes leveled, businesses wiped out, a functioning district turned into a burned outline of what had been. And if you stop the story there, it sounds like catastrophe. But the more accurate word is theft. We look at what was taken. It wasn't only property. It was time. It was safety. It was that compounded wealth that these black people had been able to finally store away, get away from the Jim Crow South, get away from the bigotry, and finally build a community that was theirs after hundreds of years of chattel slavery. We stole the inability to interact with the next generation, to hand them something substantial. And then that wasn't even the end of it. Because then the second phase begins. Not with the gunfire, but with the paperwork. Any businesses or residences that had insurance, well, the insurance claims are getting denied. The losses, those are completely undercounted. The deaths become uncertain because in the middle of Oakwood Cemetery, or what's Oakwood Cemetery now, we have mass graves that to this day, we still haven't fully explored. There's somewhere between 100 or 300 and 500 people, black people, that are dead. And nobody knows because as the smoke was clearing, they dug pits and just shoved them in there. You know, that responsibility becomes a fog, and the fog isn't minimal or incidental. The story gets pushed into the category of riot, and once it's there, the obligations change, because a riot it implies mutuality, and mutuality implies shared blame. Shared blame. What does that imply? It implies that no one owes anyone anything. Oh, the whites were to blame and the blacks were to blame. Nobody's really to blame. It is what it is. That's the mechanism. Tulsa shows you what happens when a black community is too large to disappear. So it's not deleted. It's contained. The destruction becomes undeniable, but the accounting becomes negotiable. And unfortunately, Tulsa wasn't even the first time that this happened. If you want to see the same mechanism used even less, with less ambiguity, where violence didn't just get reframed after the fact, but actually got used to seize power in the open and then have history bless the outcome. Then we go back to 1898 and we go to Wilmington, North Carolina. Before Tulsa, before Rosewood, this is where the language wasn't even kept nice and neat. And at the time, Wilmington was the largest city in the state. It had a legitimately elected multiracial government. And as odd as this is, it's true that, we had not just a semblance of equality, we actually had equity here. Black men held office. 10 of the 26 police officers were black, as was the city treasurer, the city jailer, and the city coroner. The customs collector, a black man by the name of John Dancy, he had this federal position where he actually paid a salary that was, at the time, 25% more than the governor's salary. Black citizens voted. Black professionals operated openly in civic life. The black merchants, they operated stalls in the market right next to their white counterparts, harmoniously so. And again, just so we're clear, this is 1898. So this wasn't symbolic participation, it was operational power. A fusion government and an alliance between black Republicans and white populists controlled city leadership. Now it's important to remember that this was the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, not the Republican Party of Donald Trump. Times were different. And, it was the Democrats of the time that were the white supremacists. The white populists weren't necessarily not white supremacists. They were just greedier than they were racist. And just as a digression, why are we still holding on to these two parties that have really done nothing but somehow screwed us all over and over again for centuries, only to switch sides and then do it again? Have I told you lately that this podcast is for those who haven't learned from nor learned about history? Yeah. This arrangement of the fusion party, blacks and whites working together, it threatened more than the social hierarchy. It threatened political control. So white supremacist leaders did something different here. They didn't wait for an incident. They built a campaign. At the time, we have three leaders here that we need to recognize. Furnifold Simmons, he was the chairman of the North Carolina Democratic Party and the chief architect of 1898 white supremacy campaign that flipped the state legislature. He was so controlling that he probably could have been, I don't know, somebody's deputy chief of staff. Josephus Daniels, what a name. He's the owner of the most powerful white newspaper in North Carolina at the time. So you can kind of think of him as the media magnate of his time. Newspapers were the internet of 1898, and that's where everybody got their news. So they were really popular. He probably thought of himself, pretty sly, like a fox, maybe. And Charles Aycock, he was one of the most effective public voices of the 1898 white supremacy campaign. He'd later become governor because he spoke with such a forked tongue. These three hatched a plan that included months of speeches, newspaper editorials, public decorations, all railing against Black people. They openly called themselves and what they were trying to do white supremacy. It wasn't the first time it was coined, but it was definitely effective. So Josephus realized that too many of his readers couldn't actually read. I mean, we are talking 1898, and we are talking North Carolina. And so he hired a political cartoonist to draw probably what I would say would be the most vile, divisive caricatures of Blacks. And this was so that all the white supremacists could be incensed without ever having to read a word. It's almost like, I don't know, somebody just thought for them and, they just picked it up from there. So his paper is reporting that the Blacks are the scourge of the earth. He and many others refer to them as big, burly Black brutes. He characterizes them that way in the paper, and it catches on. And of course, not one to be left out of the good fight, because again, Black men want nothing more than to rape a white woman. A white woman by the name of Rebecca Felton crusaded against the big, burly Black brutes, and said this in a speech. And I'm going to quote her here because she's just that wonderful a person. She says, quote, "If it needs lynching to protect a woman's dearest possession from drunken, ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 a week if necessary." I'm pretty sure if they had Twitter, I mean X back then, I'm sure she would have been looming all over it to make accusations about the brown and the Black folks. But we have a hero here. Alex Manley is the editor and owner of the Wilmington Daily Record. And in response to what Miss Felton says, Alex says the quiet part out loud. And I don't mean just out loud. I mean, boy, did he say it out loud. He incensed all of the white folks. White supremacists just lost their shit. He said, and I quote, "Every Negro lynched called a big, burly Black brute, when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers, and were not only black and burly, but sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very well known to all." Boom. He then went on not a step further, but a few miles further, and said, quote, "Tell your men that it is no worse for a Black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman." And he printed this in his newspaper. And boy, this really pissed off the white folks. Really pissed off the white folks. So much so that, the media magnate Josephus encouraged people, not to do anything to him, but instead had this reprinted in every white newspaper across the state, so as to really fan the flames of racism. And because, rhetoric is never enough for a self-avowed white supremacist, they went ahead and they got armed groups organized in advance. I don't think at this point they were called ICE agents, but that came later. But they were called red shirts, and they marched openly to instill fear and intimidate people of color. And this was not, we're not talking subtle intimidation. Rumors were spread by the white supremacists that blacks were stockpiling weapons, which is really freaking weird considering the fact that there were no arms dealers who were actually selling weapons to black men, and they definitely weren't even selling our ammunition to black folks. They were, however, completely selling out of their stock of weapons and ammunition to the white folks. But we don't actually need real, honest to goodness truth when rumor will suffice. All of this is so that the narrative control, so that narrative control the white supremacists had was pointedly attempting, and successfully so, to light a match on a powder keg of racism. The Democrat merchants brought in weapons of war. So the Democrat merchants in their Chamber of Commerce, they met and called themselves the Secret Nine. It was literally just the white Chamber of Commerce. They called themselves the Secret Nine. And they brought in, I'm not exactly sure how many, but at least 2 of the first mounted machine guns, and then paraded them around town to make sure that their intimidation was clear. They would show up in the black neighborhoods. They would show up at the black polling places. They would show up at the black markets. They would show up pretty much everywhere. The white supremacists, Democrats, and red shirts showed up in force just to deter the black men from voting. And it worked, because in 1898, all across North Carolina, the Democrats swept the election and the Fusion Party was essentially no more. Except there was a problem there. There were no municipal elections in Wilmington in 1898. It was all state elections. So those Fusion Party members who were already elected, they stayed in office, which, of course, thwarted the plans of the white supremacists who wanted nothing more than to get the black sympathizers and the black men out of power. So on November 10th, 1898, those who were followers of Simmons, Aycock, and Daniels executed their plans to take over by force. They started with the black-owned Daily Record. That was the first target. At approximately 8:30 a.m., a mob, and when I say mob, it started at about 500 people. It ended up with over 2,000 people. But the mob was led by Alfred Waddell. He was a white supremacist from South Carolina, and he was the one who founded the red shirts and lent them to North Carolina. But he and his lynch mob essentially marched to the newspaper office. They ransacked it. They smashed the press. They set the building on fire. And of course, the message was clear: eliminate the voice of the people before eliminating the power. Black leaders, they got hunted. Alexander Manley, who was the editor-in-chief and owner of the black newspaper, he had already left town as soon as the threats escalated. But other prominent black citizens were forced into hiding or into exile. An estimated 60 or more black residents were killed. Some estimates go higher, though the exact numbers were never formally recorded. Because again, to the victor go the spoils, and why are we going to admit that we did this? Armed white supremacists moved through the black neighborhoods, firing on residents and forcing families to flee into swamps and surrounding areas. Then they went to City Hall, because that's where the concentration of power was. The mayor at the time, Silas P. Wright, and the legally elected board of aldermen were compelled to resign under threat of violence. Literally, a gun held to their head, and the way it worked was if an alderman resigned before his time was up, then the sitting alderman could then elect a brand new alderman to take his place. Well, when you have white supremacists, who are they going to vote in? They're going to vote in more white supremacists. And so there was no legal process really here. There was no impeachment, no vote to get rid of the alderman or the mayor. At gunpoint, they were replaced. And who is it that takes over as mayor? Alfred Waddell, founder of the red shirts. And this sounds so much like present time. We get the white supremacist aldermen that now take control of the city immediately, and it was it wasn't a peaceful transfer of power. It was a mob who marched on to the seat of government. Can't make this shit up. And power was seized, formalized, and then entered into the record as governance. So we've basically had a coup d'état. But of course, we're not going to call it a coup d'état on the historical record. It was reported as a race riot. And once it was labeled as a race riot, that's problematic, because that way the transfer of power looks less like theft and more like correction, less like corruption and more like politics. And that's the distinction. In Tulsa, destruction was followed by containment. In Wilmington, violence was the mechanism of political replacement, and the language afterward made it all appear legitimate. No ambiguity, no confusion. Power seized, power renamed, power normalized, and that normalization lasted generations. Because honestly, how many of you have actually heard of this story? Now let's shift lenses a little bit. Let me put on my mental health practitioner lens, because this isn't just political history. It is psychological conditioning at scale. When violence happens and it's acknowledged, people grieve. When violence happens and it's denied, minimized, or reframed, people adapt. Think about this. How numb are we to things right now, like the Epstein files or school shootings, mass shootings in general? Exactly. They're not, you don't get the same outcome. And at an individual level, we understand this instantly. If someone harms you and it tells the story in a way that blurs responsibility, they call it mutual, they call it justified, they call it not that bad, then the injury compounds. The first wound is harm itself. The second wound is the distortion. It attacks your sense of reality. You start asking questions that aren't philosophical, they're survival. Did that happen the way I remembered it? Am I exaggerating? Am I gaslighting myself? Is it worth fighting about if everyone else is acting like it's normal? That's not weakness. That's what humans do when the environment tells them that the truth is negotiable. Communities do the same thing. Tulsa wasn't just burned. It was labeled as a riot, and then the paperwork is blurred. Responsibility took a backseat. The record, basically left room to deny what people were owed. Wilmington wasn't overthrown. It was a coup d'etat, often described as the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. And almost immediately, because look at who's in power, it was called a race riot. That one label made theft of government look like order. Now think about what that does to a nervous system collectively. When an entire community watches devastation happen and then watches institutions soften it, then the lesson isn't subtle. It tells them that your loss is debatable, your memory is optional, and your grief is inconvenient. Your demand for repair is divisive. That produces chronic vigilance, hyper-awareness, guardedness, a deep suspicion of official language, because official language has already been used to cover the harm. And if that vigilance persists long enough, it stops looking like a symptom and starts looking like culture. We're not that far as a culture, as a society, from the big, black, burly brutes. We just call them something different. We call them super predators. We label them those people. the ones who live on the other side of the tracks. Redlining's a whole different story. You know, on the other side of the equation, though, there's a different conditioning. If you grow up inside the version of history where the coup becomes a riot and mass violence becomes unrest, then you inherit a moral insulation. You inherit the ability to treat structural harm as a series of isolated incidents. You inherit comfort with imbalance because the record taught that it was normal. And that's why people argue about words, because words are not decorations. Words decide what counts as harm. Words decide who owns what. Words decide whether or not repair is necessary or just optional. Erasure is not dramatic, it's procedural. And procedure is powerful because it wears the costume of neutrality. And that's what this episode is about. Not only the destruction, but the processing. How events move from smoke to story, how riot becomes a filing category instead of a moral demand. How policy decisions after the headlines, insurance denial, zoning, block rebuilding, missing records, all of that become the long tail of the original violence. And then education, that seals it. A chapter becomes a paragraph becomes a sentence becomes nothing because we get rid of the curriculum, not because the truth has vanished. We outwork it. And so if you're listening or watching and you feel that familiar pull to say, yeah, but that was a long time ago, Chuck, understand that time doesn't dissolve unresolved harm. It just hands it off. History isn't something that we're personally guilty for, but it is something that we are responsible to. The version that we repeat is the version that survives. And that version that survives, that's what determines whether or not repair ever becomes possible. This has been episode 2 of Committed to Misunderstanding. They didn't just burn it, they erased it. I'm your host and clinical mental health therapist, Chuck Lenahan. Join me again next week where, we're going to take yet another piece of whitewashed history and return it to its technicolor reality.